Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us today. It's Tuesday and we are answering your questions about COVID-19. Today's subject will be vaccines science and vaccines and science. And I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, WHO Chief Scientist, and also Lisa Manning, who is a social scientist working on vaccine confidence and uptake. Good afternoon, Dr. Soumya. Good afternoon, Lisa. Thank you for your time. Before I give the floor to you, I will just remind our viewers, if they're watching us on Twitter, to use the hashtag AskWHO if they have questions about vaccine science, or if they're watching us on other platforms, to use the comment section and to submit their questions. Maybe we can start, Dr. Soumya, with you. If you can tell us what's the current scientific landscape of COVID-19 vaccines, and are there any new technologies being explored to produce new vaccines?
Thank you for that question, Alex. And it's really quite unprecedented, I think, to have this number of vaccines in development for one infection. So you won't believe this, but we have 129 different vaccine candidates in some phase of clinical development, which means they've entered into testing in humans, and another 194 which are in preclinical development. Now so over 300, but 129 of them more advanced. Now this covers the entire range of technologies from the older technologies like inactivated vaccines and live attenuated vaccines to the new technologies like mRNA, DNA, viral vectored, virus-like particles, and so on. Also the subunit protein vaccines which come with an adjuvant. So that's something very new this time, that we have so many different platforms being used to develop vaccines. Secondly, we've also seen a number of different adjuvants. Adjuvants are materials which are added, usually inactivated viral vaccines, to stimulate the immune response better. So we've used, a number of vaccines have used different adjuvants like matrix M and imidacquinolines, which have been used in Covaxin, for example. The third is that different delivery techniques are being tried. So not just the regular intramuscular injection, but we have intradermal, subcutaneous, that's under the skin, but also intranasal and oral vaccines. So we have a bunch of, all of these are what we call second generation vaccines. They're still in development. I'm sure some of them will prove to be very safe and efficacious, and others may not. So they do need to go through the phases of clinical trials before we know which of them is going to work better. And yes, and some of them may have advantages. Clearly, if you have an oral vaccine or an intranasal vaccine, this is easier to deliver than an injectable. If you have a single dose vaccine, that's definitely preferable to multi-dose. If you have a vaccine that can be stored at room temperature or in ordinary fridge, that's better than having a vaccine that requires -20 or -70. So ultimately, we'll be able to choose the ones that are most appropriate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. We're already receiving some follow-up questions, and one of the LinkedIn viewers is asking, why do we need new vaccines? Are current ones not good enough? So maybe we can clarify, why do we still have science advancing vaccines against COVID-19?
Very good question, actually, because this is very different from the response we see to other infections, where we wish we had more different vaccines available. So I think a number of reasons for this. Obviously, there was huge interest, there was huge investment. Many companies, many governments, many biotechs, academics started working on COVID vaccines, which is why I think we see so many. It's going to pay off, because if not for COVID, we're going to use these platforms for other infections in the future. So I think all of the science that's going on now is really going to be very useful. And it's not like the current vaccines are not good or not effective, but like I said, there could be advantages to some of the second generation vaccines. And we might also find that the mix and match approach or heterologous approach, where you take a booster, for example, with one of the newer vaccines that's being developed, maybe an intranasal one, or some other vaccine may come up. So I think this is a very positive development to see so much of research going on. This is fantastic. And I think ultimately we will have a range of vaccines to choose from, and different ones may suit different country contexts as well. So I think it will be good to have that choice. And cost will be a factor. Hopefully, some of them will be really, really affordable.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sumia. And Lisa, good afternoon to you, and thank you for your time today. As we are seeing from questions, and we've been talking about COVID vaccines now for almost a year, I mean, definitely for a year. Before we started talking about these products before they were used. And it's a lot of complex and changing science that we are learning about every day. So, but if we step back for a moment, it's not just about medical research and getting the product. It's also getting this product to people, first to ensure access, but also for them to be motivated and actually confident that these vaccines are safe. So have you done in this regard, and what is the motivation for people to get vaccinated?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Alex. It's a really good place to start the conversation. So what motivates people to vaccinate? There are a lot of different reasons, and these are often quite context specific, but it really starts firstly with people wanting to be protected from the risk of getting COVID. So there's that individual protection factor, but then there's also that desire to protect people in their family or community, other vulnerable people that they're close to. There's also having confidence in the effectiveness and the benefits and safety of vaccination. And then there's also the consideration that their provider, their doctor or a nurse might recommend vaccination to them. And they might trust the health system. They would trust their relationship, their interactions with the health system. And there might be also role models in their community who also demonstrate the importance of getting vaccinated. And lastly, there's also the consideration that vaccination can just be simple and easy and convenient to get. And I think that also helps to motivate people because they know they don't really have to go too far out of their way to get this important intervention that would potentially save their health and their life. So those are the main considerations that we think about when we're designing programs and strategies to be able to work on these different kinds of motivating factors.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And when people have questions and concerns, how do we address these? And what is the right way to talk to people who are having their concerns?
Yep. So it's normal in a context where there's a lot of new science around COVID and COVID vaccines. It's normal to want to have more information and to really understand and to make an informed choice about deciding to get vaccinated. And so we want to help people to weigh up the risks and benefits, and we'd like to be able to guide their decision. So we are aiming to create a space where people can ask these questions and raise their concerns, and that we can respond to them in a way that matches their needs, and also really takes them through a conversation where we elicit any other questions they might have about the experience of getting vaccinated. So it really starts by asking open questions to fully understand where they're coming from and the underlying considerations behind their questions. And from there, we can acknowledge and not judge. It's really important that we are kind and considerate in having these conversations, and that we share knowledge, share our thinking, and really find out about what's important, our values and our priorities in life. And from there, we can make a recommendation. And it's in going through these conversations, in responding to these questions and concerns, we can affirm that people would like to make the best choice for their health, for their family, but we can also recommend getting vaccinated. So it's possible to say things like, well, I would like you to get the vaccine, so let's go through these options. And in that way, we can really explore people's questions, concerns, and make sure we're fully addressing where they're at, and even finding ways to continue the conversation so that when they're ready, we can move them through to vaccination. So This can be a very respectful and considerate conversation that elicits and enables us to respond so that we can empower people to make these informed choices.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I'm also grateful to you, to Dr. Sumia, to Dr. Kate O'Brien, and all our other experts who are taking time actually to answer the questions from general public around the world who are having their concerns, not just about COVID vaccines, but about COVID in general or other health subjects. So we are also doing that part to create the space for conversation and help respond to some concerns. And speaking of concerns, Dr. Sumia, we are receiving several questions about variants as this virus is mutating and changing. So what are the scientists doing to make the current vaccines that we know are safe and effective to a certain extent, but to remain effective from the new variants?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So what happens is that when vaccines are being developed, they go through clinical trials, and at that time, whatever variant is circulating in those populations is what you get the results against. So this happened for several of the early vaccines that were tested when alpha was circulating around the world, the alpha variant. But other vaccines which were tested later actually had data on the Delta variant. So what happens is that once a vaccine is approved and put out for use, then we also collect what is called the vaccine effectiveness data. So once it's being used in larger populations, governments are actually collecting data both on effectiveness, that is, how much do they prevent infection, how much do they prevent hospitalization and death, and they're also collecting obviously safety information, which is also we are interested in collecting on larger numbers of people, because the initial trials are done on 20, 30,000 people. But then when it's given to millions of people, you can really find out if there are some rare side effects. So both are important. And in that process, we generate information on vaccine effectiveness against different variants. So that's how we know now that the Delta variant, that most of the vaccines are still very effective in preventing against severe disease, hospitalization, and death, but are less effective in preventing somebody from getting infected. And I think this sometimes confuses people because they say, why should we get vaccinated if we're then going to get infected? Well, you may still get infected, though there is protection against infection, but not as high. But if you get infected, the chances of you getting sick are much, much, much lower if you're vaccinated. And many, many studies around the world have confirmed this. And so the other thing we're doing, and vaccine developers are doing, is to see if they can actually tweak their vaccines. Can they modify their vaccines to face a threat with a future variant? Luckily for us so far, whatever variants we've seen, the vaccines are still working against them, the currently approved vaccines. But we don't know in the future if there'll be a variant which becomes not responsive to this vaccine. So the companies and developers are already working, scientists are working to make sure that they can actually quickly change their vaccines to incorporate a new variant. And WHO is working with developers and scientists, but also with regulators to see how such a new modified vaccine could be quickly approved. So I think the world is ready and gearing up. We've done this for influenza in the past because, as you know, we have a new influenza vaccine every year based on the composition of circulating strains of flu. So something like that may be needed for COVID. We have to be prepared. At this point, we're not sure if we will need it or not. If we're lucky, then the same vaccines will continue to work against all variants.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sumia. And Lisa, maybe looking back into uptake, because these are all the questions that people have. Why do I vaccinate if the vaccine is not 100% effective, not only against infection, but also against severe disease? So how has social science evolved throughout the pandemic to follow this medical science evolution? And do we have any evidence of what are the strategies that are working to increase the uptake?
Thank you, Alex. It's a great question as well. And so we know that absolutely we need social and behavioral sciences to be able to beat this pandemic, that we cannot rely alone on medical measures, whether it's about the measures we need to take related to hand washing, wearing masks, but now also for the vaccination. So, what have we learnt? We've learned a lot, and it's really affirmed our pre-existing knowledge about the kinds of strategies that help us to achieve high confidence and uptake of vaccination. And firstly, when we communicate or communicate about the risks and benefits of vaccination, we've really learned a lot about how to be doing that in an effective way that sustains trust and sustains credibility and reaches people in a way that's reliable and timely. And we've got a lot of knowledge now about the kinds of communications or risk communication strategies that are particularly effective in helping to inform people's decision-making process and retaining trust in the scientific process and in authorities who are working to deliver the vaccines. We've also learnt a huge amount about how to address inequities in vaccine access and delivery. And we've seen in many settings locally where there are disadvantaged or vulnerable populations, often they're being left behind, and there are challenges in ensuring that those groups are able to access vaccination services, and that there are community members who are also part of that journey in bringing them towards vaccination. So we've also learnt a huge amount about how to engage with these communities and empower them, involve them in planning, so they're really part of the process and contributing to the design of these strategies in such a way to help ensure that they're responsive to their local needs and local cultural considerations, their local languages, and other considerations that really help to ensure that the services and the design of the program there is really responsive to their needs. So there's a huge amount that has built on pre-existing knowledge about how to design these strategies. And it's really been an essential pillar of the work that we've been undertaking with all of our partners to really ensure that we're considering the full range of programmatic strategies that need to be in place to help achieve high uptake. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Lisa. And here's the next question from a viewer. What would you say to someone who is hesitant in getting vaccinated because of the unknown long-term effects of a vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a question we hear occasionally. So it's true that we're still learning a lot about COVID vaccines. Some of the things we've discussed today about effectiveness against certain variants, the duration of protection, and so on. But there's really so much that we know about vaccines and the COVID vaccines that gives experts and scientists a lot of confidence and reassurance about the long-term safety of the vaccine. So we know that severe side effects are very rare and usually happen perhaps in the first 2 to 3 months of the vaccine becoming available. And we know that the vaccine technologies, the mRNA technology, and the adenovirus, these have been studied for decades, for years, without any issue. Perhaps for other vaccine technologies like Zika, Ebola, and rabies. So there's always continuous monitoring, but experts and scientists absolutely do have the confidence to know that these vaccines will be safe in the long term. And at the same time, we do continue monitoring and our surveillance processes in countries to be tracking any unexpected events that could occur later on.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And Dr. Sumia, speaking of long-term effects of vaccines, we are receiving quite a lot of questions on how do we know that the current vaccines won't have any negative long-term effects and how these studies are done. And there are questions in particular speaking of pregnant women or breastfeeding mothers, as approved COVID vaccines are recommended for these groups as well.
Yeah, I can understand why people have so many questions. They think that how did these things get developed so quickly? That's one question. And so there's always a doubt. Have they been tested and studied properly? So this is why WHO has a very rigorous system to assess the data for each vaccine before we provide emergency use listing. And the same thing is done by regulatory agencies like FDA and the European Medicine Agency, and all the country regulators really look at the data on safety and efficacy. And particularly for vaccines, safety is very important because you're giving a vaccine to a healthy person to prevent a disease. So it has to have a very high safety barrier, and that's what we look at. Now, nothing in life is without risk, correct? And there's always, even if it's very rare, 1 in a million, 2 in a million risk of some kind of side effect. Everything in life has that. So what you have to do is to balance the benefits versus the risks. In every action we take in life, we always weigh the pros and cons, the benefits and the risks. In this case, you have to weigh the risks of getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 and getting potentially very seriously ill or even dying. And we know it's not only the elderly, younger people, people in middle age can also get very ill and then also suffer from long COVID and all its complications. So that's the downside. And then you have to balance the risk of taking a vaccine, which could be, yes, 1 in a million cases, which might have, some, in the case of some vaccines, it could be a blood clot. In some other vaccines, in the mRNA vaccines, you have this heart inflammation, extremely rare. And most of the time, if it's detected, then people recover from these side effects. So knowing about the side effects, it helps the doctors and nurses to actually to be able to pick up those events, to be able to pick up those problems and be able to treat them. So WHO has a global advisory committee on vaccine safety that's constantly reviewing the data on all vaccines. And whenever there is a signal, we inform, we put out a report, and we also change the guidelines so that people who are using the vaccine are aware. But I can say that till now, with the vaccines that we have approved, there has not been any signal which has been so worrying that we need to say, well, we need to rethink this vaccine. So it's an ongoing process, and it's something, because in a pandemic you cannot wait. Normally it takes 5 to 10 years to test a vaccine and then to roll it out. But in a pandemic, every day people are dying. You cannot wait. And that is why the best assessments are done before it's approved, but then you continue to monitor, you continue to look at efficacy and safety, and you can always change that if you find anything concerning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Somia. There are a few questions coming on scientific work on new vaccines. And you mentioned nasal vaccines at the beginning of this conversation. So if you maybe can elaborate a little bit more on this technology, and can we expect this product in use anytime soon?
So the nasal vaccine that we do have now currently that's used in some countries is for influenza. And it's so the advantages of a nasal vaccine are that, first of all, you can deliver it more easily than giving it as an injection. It could be even self-administered, for example, by somebody just like you take other puffs, inhalers. Secondly, there is a chance that it stimulates the mucosal immunity. As you know, we have the mucous membrane of the respiratory tract or of the gastrointestinal tract, and there are some vaccines that stimulate local mucosal immunity. And the advantage is that when you breathe in, obviously the viruses that we see in the air and around us, we're breathing it in. If there's a local immune response, then it will take care of the virus before it even goes and establishes itself in the lungs and starts causing problem. So that's the other advantage. But as I mentioned, these are still under development. We have oral vaccines also, like polio, for example, that it has to be a live attenuated vaccine, really, in the case of polio, which stimulates a local immunity in the gastrointestinal tract. And this helps the individual, but it also helps in population immunity. So yes, very interesting and exciting science that's still happening in this field.
Thank you, Dr. Sumi. And the next question is for those new vaccines that are still in trials. Are they using a new variants and new strains of the COVID virus to test them, or they are using the previous strains, original ones?
The majority are still using the original strain, and one of the reasons is that, as I mentioned, we found that the immunity against that strain is still protective against all the variants, at least against severe disease. So while developers are looking to see how they can modify the vaccines, I think most of them had started work early on in the pandemic in developing the vaccine, and therefore they're still using the original. But there could be many now who have multiple versions of the vaccine as well. It's easier to do with some technologies than with others, changing the variant that you want to use. So I think we may see variant specific vaccines, but again, this is evolving. The information on whether we need that kind, because obviously it takes a little more time. Then you have to develop a new vaccine, you have to do some testing to prove that it's equally safe and efficacious before you can roll it out. So it definitely takes a few months to get that done.
Thank you so much. And here is a comment from Anselm watching us from Nigeria. I have been reading a lot of negative comments about the vaccine, especially the part where I read the vaccine will affect the immune system, leading to future lack of resistance to many sickness diseases. So maybe we can clarify that this is not really the case with COVID vaccines, Dr. Sumia, and then maybe, Lisa, we can also approach this from a social science and a communications perspective on how to differentiate what is the scientific evidence or who to talk to.
Yes, unfortunately, we see a lot of misinformation and myths about vaccines which are being spread. When you take a vaccine for a particular disease, what it does is it stimulates the immune system to develop immunity, both in terms of antibodies and in terms of the cellular immune responses to that particular infection. And some vaccines, especially the live vaccines, can also boost your immune response in general. But there isn't any vaccine that suppresses your immune system or that makes you less able to react against other diseases. So certainly I can reassure you that there is no vaccine that does that. It protects you against the particular disease for which the vaccine has been made, and it will not have much impact or any impact on any other infection, but certainly doesn't harm the immune system in any way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sumia. Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It's an interesting dimension to this question as well. And absolutely. So in the early stages of the pandemic, we saw a lot of misinformation and rumors on various topics. And it was at a time when there were so many unknowns and people were trying to fill these information gaps and try to make sense of the changing world. And at that time, there were perhaps information gaps as the science was being evolving and building in our knowledge of COVID and as the vaccines were being developed. And what we've really learned is the importance not only of ensuring we can anticipate and fill those information gaps, but also making sure that information that's accurate and clear and credible, that it comes from trusted sources. And hence we're working through partners and helping to help partners work with other groups, other local representatives from civil society or NGOs to make sure that there's accurate, available information through these various sources. And what we also know that we need to do is make some of this information a little bit emotive so that it resonates with people's desire to be healthy and to be living long, healthy lives and to be protecting their families and their communities. So as part of the communications work we've been doing, It's also been about how we personalize and make this information relatable so that it resonates and can help people to respond to the questions and concerns they have, but can also perhaps build on the knowledge that they have as well about the safety and importance of vaccination.
Thank you, Lisa. And having the question coming from Nigeria, what should be done to build confidence in administering vaccines in Africa?
So, absolutely, there's a lot that we can be doing to build confidence in vaccination in any local setting, really. And it requires a few different ingredients coming together. There's no single solution here, there's no kind of magic bullet that's really going to ensure people become confident in vaccination. And what we're trying to do as well is not persuade people or not change how they think or not change their experience. We don't want to force anything on people. We're really trying to build on people's existing good intention and their existing good motivations to want to be healthy and, like I said, to protect people around them as well. So firstly, we know that there's an important dimension in the information that needs to be available about the safety and benefits and importance of vaccines and when and where to get them as well. We then also need to create the local community setting to build those social norms. And we saw in the early stages of the pandemic that when vaccines initially became available, there were no real norms to accept COVID vaccines. And those have gradually been built. And now we see billions of people around the world who've received COVID vaccines, and those norms to accept a COVID vaccine or to seek a vaccine are now, I think, firmly in place. So we're building the social influences or social structures so that role models, community influencers are demonstrating that they're getting vaccinated, and it's the norm that we all will, at some point where the vaccines are available, have the opportunity to get vaccinated. And the last important dimension that contributes to confidence and uptake of vaccination is the convenience of access, the ease of access, the availability, the affordability, and really knowing that you don't have to go too far out of your way to get the vaccine. And creating these opportunities in a way that's convenient for people who, in a time like the pandemic, the world over the last 18 months, people have had a lot of stresses and other priorities in their lives and even concerns about going out into certain places. And we've really had to create spaces and quality health services that are really close to communities and make it as easy as possible for people to get vaccinated. And if anything, in fact, that's the most important determinant of vaccination, is really having those services that are so quality, convenient, accessible that people barely need to go out of their way to get vaccinated. So those are some of the conditions that we need to create, whether it's in Africa or any setting anywhere in the world. These conditions need to come together.
Thank you, Lisa. And one of our viewers says that we want to have a choice in getting vaccinated, but feel trapped because of requirements. So what do you have to say about requirements or mandatory vaccination?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so in some countries where there's a lot of vaccine supply available, there has been consideration of mandates or requirements to ensure that people are vaccinated. And they might be justified, and there may be the necessity of a requirement or mandate to promote a public good. But we do need to balance rights and the ethical considerations and even consequences for non-compliance with these mandates. And so there's a range of considerations that need to be in place first, or a set of conditions that need to be met first before we consider these coercive measures, because we do want to give people the choice and the opportunity to make their own decisions. So first, we need to think about other strategies that can first enable us to achieve high uptake of vaccines. And this is about giving people ample opportunity to access and get vaccinated. So some of these other conditions that need to be met before we might consider mandates, in addition to having enough supply of the vaccine and a high burden of disease, we then need to ensure the vaccines are safe and effective. And we see that already for the COVID vaccines that are in use. But we need to be ensuring that service delivery obligations are met. So the considerations I described around the ease and convenience of access, that absolutely needs to be in place. Those obligations for the quality of services need to be met. And we need to have these opportunities for people to raise their questions and concerns so that they can be addressed, and that we are establishing trust in authorities and the scientific processes that have led us to have these vaccines available. And lastly, it's really important that we do not compound disadvantages by introducing these mandates, that we should not be penalising people who might be poor or disadvantaged just because they haven't been able to go and get vaccinated. So this whole implementation plan needs to be considered before we move towards mandates. And we know that it needs to be done very well, because there is the risk of a possible backlash if mandates are not implemented well. So there needs to be a lot of good communication and other strategies in place if we do go down this path, but it really needs to be a last resort.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I know we are running out of time, but Dr. Sumia, maybe we can take this question for the end from Agosu Sunday, watching us on Facebook. What are the health benefits of vaccines?
Well, I think I could confidently describe vaccines as the greatest innovation of the 20th century. You know that before we had vaccines, a huge percentage of children who were born would die before their 5th birthday due to some disease or the other. It could be polio, it could be smallpox, or it could be measles or diphtheria. And in fact, I remember growing up in India and seeing a lot of children at that time with polio in my school and in my neighborhood. You know, today, people who live in developed countries and countries where these vaccines are commonly available, many countries now vaccinate for these diseases. In fact, smallpox has been eradicated. We don't see smallpox today, and hopefully we never will. That was only because of vaccination. Polio is almost eliminated. We have very few cases occurring in just 1 or 2 countries in the world. The rest of the world, polio has been wiped out. It was a huge cause of mortality even in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, till the vaccines were developed. Think of any disease, diphtheria, measles. We don't see today the kind of suffering and death that we used to see decades ago, all because of vaccines. So I cannot think of a better product that has done more for public health than vaccines have. In fact, somebody once remarked saying you have adults because of vaccines. If you didn't have a vaccine, then 7 or 8 out of every 10 children would die in childhood of diseases. So having made a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, I think, is an incredible achievement, that too in such a short period of time. And it's only possible because of all the technological advances that have happened and the investments that countries have made in supporting research on various platforms. So it is actually amazing to think that in a year you could have so many safe and effective vaccines, and that there are so many more in development today. So it's a real tribute to the scientists. And also we've been lucky because not all diseases have vaccines. We still don't have vaccines for TB, for malaria. We don't have very good vaccines for influenza. They're about 40 to 60% effective. Here we have vaccines generally which are over 85-90% effective, at least against severe disease, the majority of vaccines that we have for COVID. So we're incredibly lucky, and we should make full use of them so that we can bring this pandemic to an end. We can stop people dying. We still have 50,000 people a week dying, unfortunately, and majority of them are unvaccinated. I saw some comments that, vaccinated people are also in the hospital and they're also dying. Yes, when majority of people in a country are vaccinated, some of them will get the infection, some of them. So none of the vaccines are 100%. Nobody's ever claimed that the vaccines are going to be 100% protective. But 90% is a wonderful amount of protection to have compared to zero. And that's why we need to make sure that as soon as you have access to a COVID vaccine, any one of the currently approved vaccines, you must take it and follow the public health guidance in your country.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya. Thank you, Lisa, for your time today and for your answers, for creating this space as well to take difficult questions. And I thank all our viewers from Ghana, Haiti, Mexico, the US, Jordan, India, Canada, Italy, Greece, Lebanon, Kazakhstan, Finland, Uganda, Singapore, and many others. Thank you for being with us today. For all information about vaccines or COVID-19, you can follow our social media channels or visit our website. And until next week, stay safe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.